We're very excited to welcome Dr. Ann Fairbrother from Exponent. She's joining us from Seattle, Washington, so it is 8 a.m. her time right now. Dr. Fairbrother has over 30 years of experience in ecotoxicology, risk assessment, and other related fields. She has a career spanning both public and private sector, from the US EPA to her current position at Exponent. I'm only picking out a couple of highlights here from her impressive biography. She has served on several National Academy of Science committees, briefed congressional committees, and served as expert witnesses in trials involving environmental risks of pollutants. And today, she will be talking to us about the state of practice for ecological risk assessment. So thank you very much for joining us today. And Dr. Fairbrother, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for spending the early part of your evening on Zoom. Hopefully we're not all too tired of Zoom yet. And I'm hoping that today's conversation will be just that, a conversation. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time and we'll go through some slides and give you some information, and then at the end, hopefully we can all come back into our squares and have a good conversation about this topic. So let me see if I can share my screen. Make this work. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my slides now. What I want to talk about today is the state of practice for ecological risk assessment, what we can do, but what we don't do. In my career, which has been long enough now that I've reached the ripe old age of 66, I've had the opportunity to see the evolution of a lot of ecological risk assessment. And I've been somewhat disappointed to see that there's a lot of really smart people, a lot of good science that's done that is not incorporated into the practice of ecological risk assessment. So ecological risk assessment is a very applied science. It's certainly made up of a lot of pieces that we'll talk about here in a minute, but it's a very applied science. It is, however, based in science and doesn't seem to incorporate a lot of the really advances that have been made in the last 20 years or so. So what I want you all to think about too, as we're having this conversation, is that you are working to help advance science in whatever part of the risk assessment field you are particularly working in. And as you're listening to this, I want you to think about how is what you are doing going to be incorporated not just into the body of science, but into the practical use of ecological risk assessment. Is that something that you are looking forward for your work to be part of? Are you thinking that your work is going to be published and then go sit on the shelf somewhere, and maybe another scientist down the road might find it and say, aha, and follow up on that? So think about this as we kind of go through a little bit about the history of ecological risk assessment. In order to know where you are and where you want to go and how to go there, it is always helpful to go back and see, where did this come from? Where did it start? Why are we doing things the way we are and where we are, and how can we advance from that? So kind of the challenge of ecological risk assessment is that it's not just one narrow field. That's the challenge, but to me, that's also really the wonder and the excitement of it, because it puts together information from many other fields of science, from toxicology, ecology, epidemiology, and the applied science of risk assessment. So you may be working in one of these more directed fields with the idea that hopefully it can be applied to risk assessment. So if we take a look at where some of these other fields started, again, thinking about why are we where we are today. Toxicology goes back to the early 1500s. Toxicology being the study of the effects of chemicals on living organisms. and also on the ecosystem when we're talking about ecotoxicology. And toxicology broadly has been thought to also include the subdiscipline of pharmacology, which would be the prevention or cure of those types of effects. So Paracelsus is generally attributed as being the father of toxicology. What I find really interesting is Paracelsus was not his given name. You can see what his given name is here. After he got a medical degree and then an advanced PhD in Italy, and then started working, and he thought a lot of himself, so he decided to call himself Paracelsus, which means above Celsus. And Celsus himself was a medical doctor from around the 1st century who kind of started a lot of the ideas of medicine. So this fellow thought that he was kind of the top of the top and called himself Paracelsus, which is how he came to be known. He lived during the time of the Renaissance, which was a period of what's called the School of Naturalists. And that's where people thought that nature, as well as God, is what influenced people's health and their relationship to it. And Paracelsus was really one of the first people who started noticing a couple things. One is that there are chemicals in the environment, particularly a lot of the different metals, that can influence our health. And he also worked to bring the scientific method into medicine in its kind of initial form, which is pay attention to what you see and learn from what you see, not just from what your older teachers are telling you. And that's kind of, it seems pretty obvious now, but it wasn't at that time. He also noticed that, and here's his quote, all substances are poisons, the right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy, or what's often said, the dose makes the poison. A very important point in toxicology, particularly when we apply it to risk assessment. So, keeping that in mind, that the dose-response relationship is something now that we're pretty focused on, but he's the one in the early 1500s that really started it. One of his seminal works is listed here on the miners' sickness and other diseases of miners. And that's where he noticed that miners were getting sick in the mine. It was basically silicosis is what he was describing. He thought it was due to lead, but the major point is that he recognized there was something in the mine that was causing the miners to get sick. So it wasn't just some bad humors, as they used to call them at the time. So a very interesting fellow and a good start to the history of the science of toxicology, if that's something that you're interested in. Current day, modern day texts, Cassaret and Dools, of course, and Hayes' Principles and Methods of Toxicology. So these are kind of the Bibles of toxicologists. Make my screen change. So the next bit that we need to think about when we're talking about ecological risk assessment is the eco part, or ecology. I want you to keep this in mind. To me, as we go through the history of risk assessment, I think you'll see that this area is the discipline that is least used, strangely enough, in ecological risk assessment. Of course, if you're interested in ecology and the natural world, you want to start with Charles Darwin, and hopefully you've all read On the Origin of Species, kind of the seminal text for ecologists as we start talking about the whole idea of evolution. And speaking of evolution, Frederick Clements in the early 1900s wrote his book about the climax theory of vegetation and talked about plant succession and plant indicators. And for a long time, Clementsian ecology was kind of the understanding of how the world worked, that you reached a climax state after going through a series of different types of ecosystems, and you'd reach a climax state, usually a forest of some sort, and it would stay there forever. That, of course, isn't true. And Henry Gleason and Robert Whitaker in the mid part of the last century of the 1900s kind of wrote their seminal work about communities and ecosystems and really started poking holes in Clementsian ecology. If you're interested in population ecology, and we need to look at that when we're doing ecological risk assessments as well. I would suggest reading the seminal work by Andrew Werther and Birch called The Distribution and Abundance of Animals. What was fascinating to me about this book is they established a lot of the basic principles about population ecology by studying thrips on roses. They're Australian, and they just went out in their backyard and looked at these little insects and studied their population dynamics on roses. So you don't have to go far to do a lot of really good work. And then the other aspect of ecological risk assessment that we need to always think about is epidemiology. And we certainly have heard a lot of epidemiology in this last year when we're talking about COVID. John Snow, as you probably know, in the 1800s in London, was one of our first epidemiologists. There was a cholera outbreak, and he was able to establish that the cholera was a waterborne disease, and he even was able to pinpoint where it came from, one particular water pump in London, discovering that by taking the handle off of the pump, and people couldn't use that water well, so people quit getting sick. And here's his book on the mode of communication of cholera. Another book that I highly recommend was written in the 1950s, called 11 Blue Men and Other Narratives of Medical Detection. It was written by an epidemiologist in New York City. And I will say, be careful if you read that book, you may want to become an epidemiologist. It's absolutely fascinating and really has some very interesting stories of medical detection. Another good work that kind of established more of the modern epidemiology was written by Brian McMahon, Epidemiology, Principles and Methods. So if you're looking at the history of these three disciplines, this should provide you some background and some ways to kind of look at where things came from. So for the rest of this morning, we really want to talk about risk assessment, in particular ecological risk assessment, and look at kind of the history of how that developed and how we got to where we are, and then how are we going to go forward from here. And in my estimation, the idea of ecological risk started with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, that she published in the 60s. And this was primarily focused on issues related from pesticides, and she was actually quite concerned about human health effects of pesticides, but also noted the problems with ecological consequences. Of course, in the 60s, we were in the middle of the organochlorine era, so we had a lot of bioaccumulation and biomagnification in the food chain, causing problems to higher order species that were predators or insectivores or things of that sort. So again, you really should read Silent Spring to see what started the ecological movement, particularly here in the US. We're going to see also that the National Academies of Sciences in the US and the EPA have written some of the foundational works for doing ecological and human health risk assessments. And you can see some of those here on the slide. And one of the things that I do want to point out as we get started with looking at the history here is you're going to see that a lot of it is very US centric. And I do believe that's because that's where the discipline started and where the work was done initially. As we move through time and we get towards the end of the 1990s, Europe joins in the conversation. And now Europe is really taking the lead, I think, and moving forward with a lot of the new aspects of science of ecological risk assessment. So in the beginning, here in the US, there was NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, that was passed in 1969. And that kind of set up the framework for the idea that anytime the federal government, and usually states will follow what the federal government does, but anytime the federal government took an action, they had to look at the consequences of that action that they were proposing and all of the other alternatives, including no action. So NEPA kind of set up the idea of doing that, but didn't say how you go about doing it. The EPA was formed 50 years ago this month in 1970 and was given the authority at that time for overseeing the use of chemicals in the environment. You can see in the 1970s, our Congress actually got things done. And they passed some of the really foundational environmental pollution acts. FIFRA is a Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, and that's for regulating the use of pesticides. The Clean Water Act is just that, for looking at discharges to, to rivers and lakes to keep them from being highly polluted and catching on fire like they used to do back in the 50s and 60s. TSCA is the Toxic Substances Control Act, and that's the authority for regulating chemicals in commerce. So those set the foundation, but again, they would have aspirational goals to protect human health and the environment without actually saying, how do you do that? How do you know which are chemicals that you can use or how much of a chemical could be in the environment? So there needed to be ways of doing that. Now, I will say that for pesticides, the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the 60s, 50s, 60s actually did look at the hazard of chemicals to human health and tried to have some sideboards and regulation about how to use those chemicals. But the U.S. Department of Agriculture's mission is to help agriculture, not necessarily to keep the environment clean. So it was not really the best way to regulate chemicals, and that was transferred to EPA. This is also when CTAC started, and we had a couple of Pelston workshops, which are kind of high-level workshops getting experts together to talk about particular topics. The two in the 1970s were looking at hazards of chemicals. How do you determine what's a hazard? How do you do that for aquatic systems? So again, that's not the entirety of risk assessment, of course. That's just looking at the toxicology aspects of these chemicals to non-human receptors, which was kind of a new thing at that time. In pesticide risk assessment, and at that time, we basically just looked at, what is a toxicity threshold? How much is too much? How much is kind of safe? And compared that to some relatively crude estimates of what people might be exposed to. So it was a pretty rudimentary way of doing risk assessment. Of course, we know that these types of hazard quotients, or what Europeans, you guys call the risk characterization ratio, which is the same thing as our hazard quotient, but flipped over. So depending upon whose work you're reading, you have to kind of let your mind understand those two differences. But regardless of which way you do it, there's no statement of probability here. This is just a single number. Either it's above, either the exposure is above or below the hazard threshold. Certainly not based on any ecological endpoints. It's based on individual effects to individual organism, reproduction, survival in aquatic, fish, particularly with growth. And there really is no statement of the magnitude of effect. The difference between the exposure and the threshold gives you some kind of indication of that, but not a really good one. So we're going to revisit this a little bit later, but it's not an ecological risk. It's just kind of more of a statement of potential hazard. And we started getting into more of a definition and an understanding of what risk is in the 1980s. Early in that decade, the U.S. passed the Superfund law, which is really called CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Restoration, Compensation, and Liability Act, which we call Superfund because that's too long to say. And that was important because that allowed and created opportunities for looking at contamination that's already in the environment. Is that causing a risk, and how much do you have to clean it up, and how clean is clean? We started having more CTAC work on now on a eco-risk. What is eco-risk? That first symposium about eco-risk, later research priorities in eco-risk. We had more discussion about hazards, this time talking about effluents. But most importantly, the National Academies published what's called their Red Book, Risk Assessment in the Federal Government, Managing the Process. And that's the first time that it set out what the structure of a risk assessment looks like. Very focused on human health. They didn't talk about eco at all, but the idea was trying to standardize all of that throughout the US government. So when we're talking about definitions, let's keep in mind what the definition is for ecological risk assessment. A process for determining the probability and magnitude of anthropogenically caused changes in existing and desired ecological conditions, processes, or trajectories. Now, you'll notice I did not include the word contaminants in here. Anthropogenically caused changes, human caused changes, so that we can apply eco-risk to any type of stressor, not just chemical stressors, which is what we usually do. But these words in blue are the important ones that make a risk assessment a true risk assessment. Probability, magnitude, and what kind of effect are we thinking about? Ecological effects. Or, as was published in the first volume of the respective journal, Risk Analysis, what can go wrong? How likely is that to happen? And so what if it does? This last question, so what, is one that, surprisingly enough, doesn't get addressed as often as we would like. So once we had those kinds of definitions and an idea of what we were trying to do, in the 1990s, there was a fair amount of work that laid the foundations and developed frameworks and guidance. EPA published a seminal purple book, Framework for Ecological Risk Assessment, in 1992. And that had this figure, which is probably the most reproduced figure in all of eco-risk assessment. But it really kind of showed the structure of how you approach doing ecological risk assessment. Very similar to human health risk assessment, but a little more focus on problem formulation so that we can really communicate what is it that we are assessing the risk to. Human health risk assessment, it's obviously people. Ecological risk assessment, not so obvious for what parts of an ecosystem are you concerned about. In 1993, Glenn Suter published his first edition of Ecological Risk Assessment. He's now published later editions on that, but that also helped to lay the foundation about how we do this type of work. In 1997 and 1998, EPA published two guidelines almost simultaneously, and I will say, having been involved in this, there was a lot of headbutting going on at the time about those two. The first was the Risk Assessment Guidance for Superfund, and that provided like an 8-step process that we still use to this day to look at contamination in the environment, existing contamination. It really is badly in need of updating, but it's still followed up like almost to the letter. The Ecological Risk Guidelines basically took the framework and put a lot of the detailed information behind it. And it was at this time in 1998 that ECHA got involved and published the technical guidance document on risk assessment. Part 2 was the eco-risk part. Part 1 was human health risk part. And this was in part getting ready for what turned into a European-wide risk analysis of metals and some of the other priority pollutants that are there in Europe. So that's a really detailed technical guidance document and provides the basis and framework for eco-risk in Europe. This last one here, EcoFram, in 1999, was a gathering of folks from industry, academia, and government from both the US and from Europe, although it was held here in the US, and was trying to look at how to do probabilistic risk assessment. Published some good technical reports, but unfortunately, it never actually got used. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So here are those documents that I mentioned about the Suter's book, the guidelines for risk assessment, and so on. Also during that decade, there was a lot of good discussion. So not only were we laying the foundations for how to do it, but there was a lot of talking about it. You can see all of the different types of workshops that we had, different levels of ecological organization, from populations to communities. What do we do about contaminated sediments, wetlands? How do we deal with uncertainty? That was the beginning of that discussion. How do we deal with multiple stressors? Very important, particularly in these days of climate change. So if you're looking at ecological processes and trajectories, how do you build climate change into that? Different types of chemicals, such as chlorinated organics. And how do you talk about and communicate what your results are from a risk assessment? And kind of speaking about that, what we were trying to do, I think, in a lot of ways, as I said, we didn't have a lot of success about being able to put some of this new science into the practice of risk assessment. So we talked a lot about this, about probabilities, about distributions of exposures and dose response profiles, and how to put that together to end up with what is the probability of an adverse effect happening. What, do you have a 20% chance of having reproductive failure in a population of birds? Instead, we still did then, and still do now, 20 years later, still use hazard quotients, which tell us nothing about a dose response profile or the distribution of exposures. We talked about looking at ecological systems and the interactions of all of the different parts of the ecosystem, looking here in a lake and the surrounding uplands and how all of the different species interact and can transfer pollutants from one to another. Or even if you just have one that, say, affects fish, what happens to all the things that eat the fish if there are no more fish, or if the size distribution of fish change? What does that do to all the things that eat it? And instead, we still see what's here on the right of your screen, what I call the wiring diagrams. And this came from the guidance for Superfund. Spend a lot of time looking at all the different exposure pathways and the different media, and then all of our wonderful critters and plants and things in the environment turn into these little dots, and you never see any of the interactions between them or the ecological processes that are going on. We talked about looking at population effects and changes to biodiversity and how spatial and habitat effects might interact in a risk assessment, and looking, as I said, about multiple sources. But again, we still just use these hazard quotients, and our benchmarks are based on individual effects, growth, reproduction, and survival. Rarely, if ever, have I seen a population model as an output of an ecological risk assessment. In fact, the only place that I really see that is when we do, in the US, natural resource damage assessments, which is basically, there's somebody put a chemical in the environment, it caused a problem to a certain species. So if I look 10 or 15 years down the road, how much problem is there going to be for that long, and therefore how much money needs to change hands? We often just look at the most sensitive species, and as I said, we only look at direct effects and not indirect effects. We don't talk about time or recovery or source sink areas or a lot of the other some basic principles of ecological consequences. Again, what happened to probability? What happened to ecology? We kind of try and talk about magnitude, but even that we don't do very well. So in the 2000s, the early 2000s, we tried to put more guidance out for being able to do this. Workshop on probabilistic risk, which was particularly directed towards pesticides, but is certainly applicable to any type of stressor that you're looking at. And I know that you had a lecture about uncertainty and how to describe that, and that there are wonderful mathematical ways of being able to do look to develop the uncertainty analysis part of risk assessment and use distributions in your analysis. So back, in the 80s, we were constrained because we didn't have computing power to be able to do that, but there's no such constraints now, so I don't think you have an excuse for not doing it. We also had a workshop on population level eco-risk, and then EPA had their own workshop to try and train people on how to do it, how to apply changes in reproduction and survival to a population model. But what was also happening at the time was looking actually downward instead of upward, and looking at genomics and looking at adverse outcome pathways. How can I measure something at the cell level and tell you what's happening to a population? Personally, I don't think you can, but there's a fair amount of reading you can do in that area as well. The National Academies tried to update the Red Book, but the Red Book still seems to be a primary staple. And then the framework for metals risk assessment, again, was looking at guidance, particularly for inorganics in the environment, naturally occurring, but too much, of course, can be a problem. And it brought out some of the other concerns, such as bioavailability and how the environment influences the bioavailability of metals. So here are some of the works that are important in putting eco back into ecological risk assessment from the workshops, and a couple of books that are definitely worth reading. This is Suter's second edition of his book. And I want to take just a few minutes to kind of talk about that, because this is one area that is notably missing. Whether you're doing a risk assessment for a new chemical, such as a pesticide or a chemical in commerce, trying to get some information about what does it mean if you have a certain level of reproductive effect or a certain level of effect on survival. It doesn't always mean that you're going to have a crash in a population, that you're going to lose the organisms that are being exposed. There are compensatory and depensatory mechanisms that occur within a population and within a community. And lack of understanding of this, I think, leads to a lot of way overly conservative risk conclusions. This is particularly true when we're looking also at exposure, not just the hazard side, but the exposure side, where often what we do is just say, well, what do we think is going to be the maximum level of exposure, and let's protect against that. The maximum amount in the environment is not necessarily the maximum amount of exposure, particularly if you have an organism that moves through the environment and integrates exposure across an area that's larger than any of your measurement units. So keeping in mind that there are a lot of better ways now, particularly with our computing ability to do this type of mapping and to look at movement of the organisms through the environment. Or when you're talking about sessile organisms like plants, what is their distribution within the environment, that they're not all just located in the red zones? And what does that mean in terms of a community level effect? And finally, we get to this last decade, which is what I think of as the decade of specialty eco-risk guidance. We talked some more about problem formulation, but we also looked at how do you assess risk to bees in particular, and pollinators in general, but bees in particular because they do have an economic aspect as well. And then also looking at endocrine active substances. So a fair amount of work in that way. Tried to talk about improving usability in eco-risk, and I guess that's some of what we're trying to talk about today. So we're still moving forward. There's still work being done to try and increase the usability of eco-risk and how to put science into eco-risk. Put the work that you're doing to work as we try and make decisions about chemicals in the environment. So we're always going to be making management decisions in that way. And we want to base them on a good solid base of science and knowledge, and not just, well, what's our best guess? So again, eco-risk, probability, magnitude, and ecological conditions. We don't really have probability statements. We're still using hazard quotients. Magnitude effects, often, and particularly when we look at hazard quotients, there's no information about the slope of the dose response curve. So I don't know if I put just a little more chemical in the environment, is that going to be catastrophic, or is it not going to mean anything at all? I have to put a lot more into the environment. What does it mean if I have an LD20 or an LD30 or an LD40? Those might be different things to different species, depending upon how they deal with mortality rates in that species. Thinking about small mammals, for example, where 80% of them die every year anyway, is an LD20 going to be of concern to them? In silico methods are looking like a way of getting around testing live animals, but we have still a lot of questions about relative species sensitivity and tolerance. Importance of routes of exposure, the in silico methods don't talk about that. Yet dietary exposure in wildlife, for example, can really make a huge difference about whether or not a substance is toxic. And in plants, whether pollution comes from the roots or from the air also results in different responses. And it still uses most sensitive species and most sensitive endpoints. We also, as I've been saying, need to put things into ecological context. This is to answer that so what question. Why do we care if we have some kind of an effect? And we also don't do a really very good job yet on relative bioavailability. This means a lot about knowledge of environmental chemistry, species differences in foraging locations, field versus laboratory differences, soil differences, sediment differences, and things of that sort. Multiple stressors, we've talked about a lot over the years, but we still seem to do chemical analyses one chemical at a time. For registration of chemicals like pesticides or chemicals in commerce, in some ways we're constrained by the law to have to do that, but I think there are ways that we can look at what is currently in the environment as the background against which we need to make decisions about new chemicals. We also need to start doing a better job at a weight of evidence approach, causal analysis, so that we can pull in more lines of evidence than just the hazard and the exposure, but ask questions related to what is it that is currently going on in the environment? What can I see? What do I know about what is there? And how do we verify our results? Very rarely do we see anyone going back and say, how well did I do on my risk assessment? Did I get it right? Of course, risk perception and communication is always important, and the precautionary principle is part of European law. So how do we incorporate all of that, not just into doing the risk assessment, but in communicating the risk assessment and using it? Obviously, as we've gone through all this, it's complicated. There's a lot going on. The risk assessor can understand all the complexity of it. Then they have to get the risk manager to understand and to use it, and get the public to accept it. So it's a non-trivial thing to be involved in. It's really exciting, and I think it's very much of a way of integrating many different scientific disciplines. That's quite exciting. So I hope that all of you feel that way too about the work that you're doing and how that can contribute to this type of discussion and to moving the science of risk assessment and the use of risk assessment forward. So I'm going to open up the floor now to have a discussion with you and see what your thoughts are about this topic and your work, and what your aspirations are of where you hope to see all of that go. So it's hard to do a discussion on on Zoom. So John, do you have a way that you do that here with this group?
Yes, usually we either, if people have questions or anything like that, send them through the chat or raise their hand. And then we just sort of go person by person in that method. So yes, does anybody have any questions or comments to start us off? Yeah, Rudy.
Thank you very much, Anne. It was a very brief presentation, and you touched all the elements. In my case, I'm using around 4 or 5 population models because my study is more related to finding the critical pest pressure, and for that we require all the existing phenology, and it has to be validated under regional climate conditions. So it's not necessary that we are using the lab results from somewhere else, and we have to validate it here as well. The other problem which we really find it how to there are few models or few integrated works which has been done so far which kind of simulate it in a spatial explicit model, and that is where I find it really challenging to pick or to develop a specific pest phenology model. For example, we are using a corn borer, and then on the other hand, it's a corn rootworm, which is very different. And then we are using wireworms as well, which is completely different. I think there is only one. There are only empirical approaches for that. So for wireworms, it gets really even more difficult to make a specialization simulation kind of. So my question was, yes, population models. Yes, we are studying it. We require it. It's one of the most important leverage point. But when it comes to make it spatial explicit, we kind of miss a few interlinking components and how to link it to come up with a better management perspective. That's what I find it challenging. So do you want to have any comments on that? How to link it with the risk assessment?
Right. So I guess that's really not what I want to talk about today. What I want to challenge you with is you are using available tools and then adding some more knowledge and information to that.
Yeah.
And you have a goal that you're trying to get to, which you probably will if you keep at it long enough. So once you get there, what are you going to do with that? It sounds like something that the ag chemical companies could find very useful as they're trying to develop different products that maybe would be more specific to those particular pests. It might be something that the regulators would find useful, again, as they're trying to understand if you put some products in the environment, is it going to have the desired effect? So the real challenge to me is how do you take your work and put it out in a way that it then becomes used? And so part of that might be a easier user interface.
Yeah.
And
that's what I was talking about, the user interface when we lack the damage data. And that makes the phenological model even more it puts it in a difficult position to actually simulate a pest population under an agricultural system where damage data is kind of missing.
Right. Although, again, some of those data may be available, but just not publicly. But still, part of what you also want to do is to be able to say, given today's information and what we have available today, this is the best answer I can give you.
Yeah.
Here are the uncertainties that remain and the questions that remain, but it's better, it's a more informed and more detailed answer than just, well, in general, this might work. So I don't think you have to stop and not use a new tool because it's not perfect. Okay, and I think that's another big take-home message. And a lot of times I find people say, well, but it doesn't give us all the answer because we're missing this and this and this. But it gives you more of the answer than what you currently have. So use it and know what the limitations are so that you don't have overconfidence in it. But every step in that direction, if we can put it out into the user community, allows us to move forward and allows people to build on it. So your work can become foundational for the next set of studies that are done. So don't give up.
Yeah,
that's going.
that's why we are using. I'm using one of the new modeling method, the agent-based simulation, D.V.M. So yeah, it's challenging, but yeah, I don't have to give up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rudy. Matt asked a question via chat. Matt, do you want me to read out the question, or did you want to jump in? Okay, I will read his question. He wants to know what you see as the greatest challenge to estimating risks of chemical in the year 2050, which is our mandate in the project. Matt also indicates he cannot talk right now. So
I think if you truly are wanting to do ecological risk assessment and not just chemical in the environment risk assessment, the greatest challenge is being able to look at a changing environment. Our environments are changing. They're changing relatively fast, and it's going to change faster because of two things. One is climate change, and the other is human population, and where people want to live and work and how they live and work and what they do, and that's constantly changing and impacting the natural systems. So if you're looking at the effects of chemicals in the environment, you're going to have to take those two things into account, and that's a huge challenge. Not just in terms of distribution of species, but also how the chemicals themselves interact in the different types of media that they're in. As temperatures change, as flow regimes change, how's that going to affect your aquatic systems? So putting your risk within that kind of context of the stress of climate change, the stress of human population change is going to be quite a challenge. It already is. And I think we've not been paying enough attention to it.
Sort of as a follow-up, Matt is interested in the uncertainty about new chemical products that might be introduced into the future.
So I personally think that that's not a major challenge to the science of risk assessment. I think risk assessment is a process that you can do on any kind of chemical, on any kind of stressor that you put in the environment. The actual effects of those chemicals on the organisms that you're concerned about, or how do they get distributed in the environment, and therefore what's the exposure regime going to be, those could be specific to the chemicals, but the process of how you assess the risk of them is not. You're going to ask the same questions. Well, how much is too much, first of all, and where's it going to be? And then you put those together to answer the so what question. I kind of looked at this question a number of years ago in the 90s, early 2000s. Actually wrote a paper with my daughter on this, so that was really fun to be able to write a paper with your with your daughter, and we were looking at nanomaterials that were just kind of getting started as being a major new type of chemical pollutant in the environment. And that was a question: do we have to have a whole new structure for how we assess the risk of nanomaterials? And kind of really delving into it, it's no. They do cause toxicological changes in different ways than the larger size chemicals that we're more used to, but the science of risk assessment is still the same.
Okay, thank you very much. I have, maybe it's a bit of a similar question or a related question, but you presented a lot of, I think, a really, really interesting history about the different kind of things that have been looked at, or different elements to fold into risk assessment that haven't yet. And so could you speak possibly to a little bit if there is sort of at the legislative level hesitancy to incorporate these new methods, and maybe in terms of how we might be thinking about how the information that we're generating now can be used looking into the future, what may be some of the biggest issues there at the policy legislative level would be in terms of incorporating these potentially new methods?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's actually a pretty broad question, because there's the sort of policy level and there's the regulatory applications of the policy, and then there's the public dialogue and acceptance of that. So let's kind of look at them a little bit separately. At the policy level, there's differences, very large differences in different jurisdictions. Europe is very much more attuned to the precautionary principle of, until we know enough, let's not do anything. Although to me that has some issues of, well, you haven't addressed the question of whether do nothing is better or worse than the new thing that's being proposed. But that's kind of one policy level. In the US, it's different. Here in the US, it's let's go forward and see what happens. We kind of have some sidebars on it, but it does put more of the onus on to kind of looking what happens after you start using something. So from a policy standpoint, those are two very different policies to look at the use of chemicals in the environment. Also, policy makers generally write relatively broad guidance. We want to protect human health and the environment. And translating, well, what does that actually mean, becomes very controversial very fast, strangely enough. So from a policy level, that, those are just big, broad statements. And then the regulators have the authority to interpret those statements. And regulators tend to be very conservative and to err on the side of what they see as protection. And again, if you do sort of a comparative analysis, that's great. But also, if you don't have the right information to put into your analysis, even your level of protection may either be way overprotective or perhaps not as protective as you think it is, because you haven't really put in all of the information that's required to come to an appropriate decision. So regulators will almost always err on the side of being very protective. Industry, of course, will push back on them, and then that, to me, creates a really interesting dialogue, and where I think we end up with some of our compromise. And then why, once products start being used, we need to have monitoring available just to make sure that, did we make the right decision? Were we protective enough? Were we too protective? And I think Rudy was pointing out some of the issues related to to insect pests in agriculture, and kind of where is the level of protection of the environment versus being able to manage those pests in agriculture. And then finally, there's the public acceptance of risk assessment. And this is where we get to some issues that's happening quite a bit these days. First of all, as I think you probably know from your conversations about uncertainty, most people don't understand probability. So other than saying, there's a 50% chance it's going to rain today, well, what does that mean? It's going to rain half the day, or all the time it may or may not rain, or it's going to rain in half the places, or so even something as what seems like as simple as that can create confusion. So when you're talking about the probability of risk, that becomes even harder for people to comprehend and understand. And what I've heard from regulators, particularly those who are at the decisional level, like the head of EPA, don't bring me a probability statement. I can't make a fast decision by saying, well, there's a 20% chance that something's going to go wrong. I just need to know, is it or isn't it? And then I can make my decision. So again, even at the regulatory level, the whole idea of uncertainty, which is what risk statements really are, is something that is apparently not as useful as just a bright line, which puts the onus then on the risk assessor and the scientist to use your own judgment and be able to say, well, if there's going to be a 20% probability of reproductive effect in fish, that probably can affect the population. If I do a model, it looks like it really will. So I'm just going to say, yes, this is too much. So it puts a lot of that onus on the scientist, which then gets to the next problem, which is that these days in a lot of our public, they don't trust scientists anymore for reasons that go way beyond our discussion here. So again, public trust, I think, has been eroded in both the scientists and in government. And so as we are trying to apply risk assessment, and it just quickly spirals into a public dialogue of, I don't believe, or I do believe, or this could be good, or I've heard that. And so we get a lot of emotion that then gets interjected into the risk assessment dialogue and decision. So a wide-ranging answer to your question, John.
No, thank you very much. That was a very, very great answer. We have, I think, maybe 1 or 2 more minutes before 6 o'clock. So I think we can take another question if anybody has one. Yannicka, I see you raising your hand.
Yes, I could ask many questions, but I wanted to see if anyone else wanted. First, Anna, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I saw some of the similar slides at CTAC North America last year, and I've shown and quoted some of these slides earlier because it was such an inspiration for me. We were in our little group here, we were working on probabilistic approaches, trying out probabilistic approaches to risk assessment, and I was wondering, there was all these efforts like 20 years ago, and what happened, and why did it seem to have stopped, and why? And you've addressed these questions I had in my mind now, and we're actually trying to write a paper on this topic as well, so this has been very useful to get this whole history back from the 60s, but I'm trying to get to a question. Well, you highlighted probability, magnitude, and ecology, and so some of these students try now probabilistic methods, but then when we get feedback in meetings like CTAC meetings, some people will say, oh, that's a step in the right direction, but then you should also do this and this and this and this and this. And like you were also saying, all these things that are not considered yet or not dealt with. So I guess my question is where, if you should give a recommendation to these students who have only 2 more years to go with their work, what should they prioritize? What would be the most important improvement in your view to get a risk assessment in the more in a better direction, or in the direction you think is important?
Well, yeah, I think that's a bit of a loaded question, and in some ways, I'm not sure that it really matters. I think that anything that anybody does will help the science move forward, whether it's better environmental chemistry so that we understand uptake and bioavailability better, whether it's in toxicology so that we could understand more about how the chemicals affect organisms and differences between species and laboratory to field extrapolations. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And the ecology of being able to develop the models to take the toxicology and say, how does that affect populations? How do we look at community effects of benthic invertebrates or plant communities? I do truly believe that putting probability statements into risk assessment is something that needs to be done. It can be done. And again, the problem is the communication of that. How do you get the user of the risk assessment to understand what the probability statements are telling them? So I don't think that's as much of a technical challenge as it is a user and communication challenge. So I think that we should all still be working very hard and very diligently in our area of focus and what it is that we are interested in. And at the same time, collectively, we all need to work on how do we communicate our results and risk assessments to regulators, to industry, and to the public in a way that makes it useful. Given how much people are now used to interacting with computers and computer games, I would think that one area of work that we might want to think about incorporating is risk communication and the user interface, to make it easier for people. Because I think some of what happens is risk assessment users might throw their hands up and say, it's so complicated, I can't possibly do it. And we've tried over the decades to make things easier, but still looking at an Excel spreadsheet or trying to do a Bayesian diagram can be really intimidating for regulators. So if we could just join up with the gaming community and make some good interfaces, I think we might even have success with explaining what probability is. I really do think that the bottom issue, the real issue, is communication from all of us who are scientists that really understand the nuts and bolts of what's going on here. And one of the things that I will often say is there aren't that many people who will question an engineer about building a bridge, right? What's the risk of my driving over that bridge? Should I stop and think about this before I drive over that bridge? Well, we believe that the engineers put enough safety factors in there and knew what they were doing, so I feel safe driving over that bridge. But somehow everybody seems to think that they know, well, what's the risk of putting this chemical in the environment and how's it going to affect my forest? Well, why do you think, general public should know that? The complexity of a forest is no less than the complexity of a bridge. So somehow we have to get beyond that step of, well, everybody understands the natural world and therefore can make their own risk decisions. So stick at what you're doing, but think about how to communicate it.
Very good advice.
After many years of trying to do that, unfortunately, often unsuccessfully.
While you were talking now about giving a simple example, or what came to my mind was this flatten the curve graphics that was very popular when the COVID first broke out. I don't know if you know what I'm referring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a very simple illustration, or even an animation, which I think most people could understand.
Yeah.
So maybe we should try to communicate in that kind of simple way with animation or simple graphics.
And for communicating to the public, yes.
Yes.
Regulators always want to be able to do it themselves. So again, that's where we have to have the tools, but have a way that makes it easy to use them.
Well, luckily for us, we actually have a workshop coming up towards the end of March that's dedicated to communication. And I know some people here on this call are currently working on it. So good to know that that's should be a major focus for us. Yes, unless there are any other burning questions right now, we're 7 minutes over. So Dr. Fairbrother, thank you so much for sticking around a little bit later with us here. Yeah, thank you so much for really, I think, just the great advice and helping us put our PhD work into perspective and looking into the future. So yeah, really appreciated the discussion. And thank you again. Have a great day.
Well, thanks to all of you. It was fun. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.